Good morning, everybody. I am here with Megan and Carly. I'm going to let both of them introduce themselves in just a minute, but my name is Bethany Miller, and I'm the wife of Eric Miller, who is normally the host of these digital labs for CE, but he has asked me to step in and host today, given our topic, which is the challenges and joys of being a pastor's wife, and I would extend that even to just being a ministry wife, because I've spent the last several years as a pastor's wife. Eric's title is no longer pastor, but we are very much in ministry. And so we know that this extends to not just those who hold the title of pastor, but really anybody who's in ministry. And so we want to be inclusive of all who are walking this journey. And that it is being a pastor's wife or a ministry wife can have challenges and joys. And so Megan and Carly and I are going to just spend some time this morning chatting through that. So Megan, would you maybe start us off and just tell us a little bit about yourself and your background and kind of a brief synopsis of your journey as a pastor's wife?
Okay, my name is Megan Johnson. I've been married to Adam for 14 years, and we've spent all of those years in vocational full-time ministry. Adam was a youth and young adult pastor for 9 years first. We served at Myersdale Grace Brethren Church in Pennsylvania. And then we also served at Martinsburg Grace Brethren Church in Pennsylvania, and we just keep moving east. So for the past 5.5 years, we have been living in Hatboro, PA, which is a suburb right outside of Philadelphia. So 5.5 years ago, we moved here to lead a church plant here, which has been a great joy. So I think over the years, my role and my ministry has kind of changed with different seasons in different places. But the things that I've consistently been passionate about are I'm passionate about discipleship, really passionate about teaching the Word, teaching how to study the Word, and using my home for ministry has kind of been the things that have been consistent. Oh, and we have 4 kids. I should have mentioned that. We have 4 wonderful kiddos ranging in age from 3 to almost 12. So that's a little bit about us.
Nice. Carly, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Sure. My name is Carly Nicodemus, and I was a youth ministry major at Grace College, and it was through youth ministry that I met my husband, Dave, who is currently a youth pastor. So we actually, kind of a funny story, we had met originally when I was interested in leading Operation Barnabas, and I didn't know anything about Operation Barnabas. I didn't grow up in the Charis Fellowship, Grace Brethren Fellowship, and I was kind of hoping to be on Dave's team because I knew him. We were kind of friends, and we were hoping that we'd be on the same team. But by that summer, we were engaged. So we got put on separate teams. So we spent our first summer engaged on opposite Operation Barnabas teams, but it kind of set us up for basically what ministry is like. And so we've been married now for 16 years, and we have 4 kids. They range in age from 6 to 14. And our first ministry job was in Coatesville, Pennsylvania, right outside Philadelphia, where he was a youth pastor for about 3 years. And then we moved here to Columbus, Ohio, and we're at Grace Polaris Church, where he's involved as a pastor in different varying roles for the last, 13 years now. We've been here. So, yeah.
That's great. Thank you both. Well, for those who don't know me, again, my name is Bethany Miller, and I'm married to Eric Miller, who's the Director of Ministry Operations at CE currently. That's a new role for us. So Eric and I have been married for just over 7 years now. So you both probably have a lot to teach me. You've got a few more years under your belt. I grew up in a Christian home, but I would say I've never lost my faith, but I definitely lost my way with God in my early 20s and had wandered kind of from church life and from walking with the Lord. And yet I was living on Long Island and got connected with a church there, and that kind of, I won't go into a whole story, led to being involved with a church plant. And that's what I was doing. And so had found my way back to a relationship with God and ministry when I met Eric. We met online, actually. But he was living in Maryland as a youth pastor at Grace Community Church in Frederick, Maryland. And so he was there when we met, and I made the leap to move down to Maryland. And shortly after, we were engaged and married. And so became a ministry wife that way. And so kind of came into it later in the process. But since then, we've had 2 kids who our oldest just turned 4 and our youngest is almost 2. So we've got the little ones at home. And then Eric was youth pastor and then spent our last couple of years there as discipleship pastor. And then at the beginning of this year, we got a call from CE asking if he'd be interested in this new role. And we just really felt God's call on that confirmation. So we've stepped into really a kind of a new chapter of ministry that also involved a move to Akron, Ohio, which is where we are now. So that's kind of my role. And we talked a little bit about wanting to just be inclusive of everybody who's in ministry and not just pastors' wives, but ministry families, really, because it is a unique and interesting journey. And so today, our goal for our conversation is really to acknowledge that being a ministry family and being a spouse of someone in ministry has a lot of challenges and a lot of difficult seasons. And there's a lot to process and handle in that. And so even in talking and praying with Carly and Megan before we started this conversation, if whoever's listening, if you're out there in one of those challenging seasons, we want you to know that you're not alone. And we hope that you feel heard and understood and that you have some supports around you. But we also want to be sure that we're holding that tension with the fact that God's called us to really unique position and really given us a privilege to serve alongside our spouses in ministry, and that there's great joy and great blessing in that. And if you're in that season, we want to celebrate that with you also and acknowledge it. So we kind of want to be sure that we're balancing both of that. So I'm just going to dive in here with some questions for Carly and Megan, but we're just going to see how the conversation goes and where we end up. So for both of you, and you kind of, I think Carly, especially you kind of touched on this, and so maybe I'll start with you, but is before you got married, was there a desire to be in ministry? It sounds like that was true for you, but how has that evolved as being a spouse of someone in full-time ministry?
Sure. It was more of a recent thing in college where I decided I wanted to go into ministry before I met my husband. Actually, it was on a trip to Urban Hope in Philadelphia that I actually went on the trip because I was dating somebody else who was on the trip. And I thought, hey, I have a free week. I'll just go with you to Urban Hope this summer. And God really got a hold of my life there. And I was like, wow, I think I could spend my whole life doing ministry. This is amazing. And came back and when I met my husband then and found out he wanted to be a pastor, I'm like, this is great. The tricky part for us was having both been ministry majors, and then we went into our first ministry job. We were both, equal co-partners doing everything together. And it was after our first son was born, I realized my role had to change a little bit, that I started to deal with a little bit of resentment toward him that, hey, he gets to go do this overnighter, but if I want to come, I need to find a babysitter or bring my son with me, and I can't do everything that I used to do. And so in our marriage, we had to work through that in our marriage as my role began to shift, and I had to accept that it was okay that my role was shifting because, like, hey, I'm a youth major too. I want to be involved as much as you are. And I realized that that's not what God had for me, and I can still be involved, but it had to evolve a lot from what I originally had planned. And I think Megan alluded to this too. Like my role is constantly evolving, and I have to take it year by year. Some years I can be more involved with others, and that's okay. And I need to realize that God has given me my family, and that's a ministry in itself. And I don't have to always be in the church building to be serving. So.
Yeah, that's powerful. Thank you. Megan, how about you?
For me, I was trying to think back, and I remember a BNYC, actually, what is now called Momentum, but I think it was the summer before my senior year of high school. I don't remember the context or the speaker or even why the question was asked, but I remember them basically like issuing a call for like to come forward or to have somebody pray with you if you were feeling a call or a leading into vocational full-time ministry. And at that point, I mean, I really wanted to be a teacher and was still planning to go to school to be a teacher. I was dating Adam already, but he was not planning to go into full-time ministry at that point in his life either. So I remember feeling like, I don't understand why I'm feeling so strongly about this, but I just feel like I need somebody to pray with me. And I felt the Spirit just kind of pressing in on just this would be something that I should be open to or start to pray about. So I remember my youth pastor and his wife praying with me. And really at that point, like I said, I didn't know how it was going to play out. I don't think I even, maybe it was emotional even. I'm not sure, but I do remember that as kind of being a fence post and kind of being willing to do that if that's what God wanted me to do. I grew up with my dad being super involved in ministry, but at that point he wasn't doing it vocationally. So that was kind of my frame of reference. So when God did call Adam to go into full-time ministry, it was kind of a natural progression, that we had already done a lot of ministry together kind of as a team, even before we got married. So it felt like a very natural kind of thing that we would both be called into. I would say, as I looked at how it's evolved, or this journey that God has taken me on, looking back, I feel like at the beginning, I thought I knew what I was doing. I went into this probably a little overconfident and like, I'm really good at this. I'm ready to do this. Let's go. Let's do it. And I think the thing that has probably changed over the past 14 years is that I realized how little I know, how much I don't necessarily know what I'm doing, and how desperate I am for Jesus. So 14 years in vocational ministry, now I can see where God has grown me more confident. I'm more confident today in my calling, and more confident today in the ways that he's gifted me, but I'm much less confident in my own strength and my own wisdom and my own abilities. Especially, I think, making the transition to leading a church plant. It was really, really good to show me my inadequacy and my need for the Lord to do this, that it really didn't depend on me, and it's not about me at all anyway. So I think probably as a senior in high school, my view of vocational ministry was probably very different than what it would be now. My view of the church is very different than now than it was then, in a good way. So I'm very thankful for what God has taught me along the way, even the ways that he's broken me and torn things down and taken me to deeper levels of the gospel myself. So I'm thankful for those mileposts. But yeah, more confident than ever that this is what we want to be doing and that we're where God wants us to be.
Yeah. And I think I'm hearing from both of you just that that need to be seeking God's guidance. And sometimes when we're not, which I have, number one, guilty over here at times of, I've got a plan and this is what I'm doing. And I can very much get stubborn about that and getting that. And God has a way of kind of like knocking on the door and tapping me on the shoulder and going, no, I'm over here and we're going to have to talk about this because I've got this plan over here. And does so, at times in a very challenging way, but also in such a, God can be so gentle in that, also in just pulling me and edging me and kind of moving over to say, I've got this other plan over here that you need to look at. And I know, just speaking my own vulnerability with that, of a few, I guess it wasn't even years ago, it's not even that long ago, we were walking through a rough season of ministry and just a really challenging time of some hurts and frustrations and not sure what to do with those and what does this all mean, and kind of crying out to God and saying, what are you doing with all of this? And there was a verse in First Peter that really just got a hold of my heart about God restoring us and redeeming us. And it says, after you have suffered a little while. And I remember that was just such a wake-up call to me. And I really started down a new journey with God of I think walking with a very open hand, of saying, I trust that you have a plan for us in this. And I felt like God kept telling me, like, just look at me. Don't look at all this stuff that's going on. Look at me and walk with me, and I'm going to show you a new plan. And Eric and I are, like I said, we're starting a new chapter now in a new place, and he's starting a new job. And I have, in the entirety of our marriage, I have always worked a full-time job in nonprofits outside of ministry. It is its own ministry, but outside of the church or any of his role. And so even that is wrapping up. And so trying to walk forward to kind of that evolution you're both talking about of saying, okay, God, what is it that you have for me and how can I serve you best? Because he has gifted each of us differently and has a role for us. And so I am recording from home, so I apologize for the dog in the background. This is family life, right? In the middle of COVID. So excuse the dog barking. But maybe that's her telling me, wrap up and move on to the next question. So in that, as you guys do kind of evaluate what your roles are at different times, have there been times that you've wrestled with expectations from others? And I'm not even going to try to qualify that because I think it can come in multiple formats. So have you just struggled with expectations at any point? What does that look like for you, and how do you navigate through that?
I think certainly there are expectations. I feel like most of them, though, are ones I put on myself that I feel like I need to fit this role and, have this persona as being a pastor's wife. But it's just such a unique role. I've talked to other youth pastors and pastors' wives before. Like, if your husband is a doctor, you're not expected to be there every surgery that he's performing, or but like, it's so different with the pastor. You're expected to be there for everything that your husband is doing, but it's kind of a unique role because in other vocations, wives usually aren't there at the office with them every day and going to their business, their meetings. But as pastor's wife, it's kind of expected. And my husband took a few years off. About 6 years ago, he took off 3 years from youth ministry and did other ministry at our church. And when he jumped back into youth ministry a couple years ago, about 3 years ago, one of the first questions I got from someone at the church was, well, now that, you're working almost full time now and your husband's back in youth ministry, how are you going to handle being at everything again? And my first thought was like, do I need to be at everything? Like, why is it expected that I need to be at everything? And it's just kind of a expectation, I think, that's unique to the role of a pastor's wife. I don't know if Megan, if you have anything that you want to add to that or not, but.
Yeah, I think the thing that I'm finding, and especially as I talk to other women in ministry that are partnering with their husbands, I think the important thing to remember is that the expectations for a woman being married to a pastor really shouldn't be any different than the expectations upon any woman who is in Christ and is following Jesus. So I think the expectations of like, that they should know the gospel, that they should love Jesus, that they should know the word, that they should love people, and that they should use their spiritual gifts, right? Like, if we are in Christ, like, those are things that should flow naturally out of all of our lives. So I think when there are other expectations put on beyond that for a woman married to a pastor, those can be a little unfair because we're not all gifted the same way. We don't all have the same gifts. We don't all have the same personalities. And nor do you, I remember even like coming into a situation where someone was like, and it was an older gentleman, but he just said like, you're the pastor's wife? Do you play the piano?
Mm-hmm.
He went through this list of like, if you're a pastor's wife, these are the things that should define you or that were expected for you to do. But I would just, a reminder that like, to be a pastor's wife, we do not need to all have the same personality or the same spiritual gifts. So anything beyond that, the expectation would be that we're pursuing godliness, that we're pursuing Christ and Christ-like character. And I think also something that I've found to be tricky in ministry is there can be expectations kind of on opposite ends of the spectrum. Sometimes those expectations are that you are very involved and this is what you should do and this is what you should be involved in. But I've also been in situations where the expectations are kind of the opposite of like, this is your husband's job and you don't really have a role in this at all. Which is in some points has been more tricky for me because I have always been passionate about it. And so sometimes people don't know what to do with me if I do want to be involved and we do work kind of as a team. So I think like there can be both ends of the spectrum with these expectations. But the thing that I'm learning the most over these years is that I have to be firmly rooted in the gospel. I have to know that my identity is not in being a pastor's wife. My identity isn't even in being a mom or whatever job I'm doing or whatever. My identity is in Christ as a child of God. And so he sets my identity. Just learning that my value and my worth is not in what I do, or how I perform, but my value is in who I belong to. So I think the deeper I go into the depths of the gospel, the more freedom and peace and joy there is in knowing that I don't have anything to prove. I have the freedom and joy in pursuing Christ and using the gifts or the passions that he's given me, but I don't have a specific mold that I have to fill. So as someone who I can, in my personality and the things that I wrestle with, I can very much make an idol out of the approval of others. So as a pastor's wife, that can be a really dangerous combination. If I'm longing for the approval of man or the dealing with the fear of man, that can be really dangerous because it kind of leaves us like, when things are going well and people think very highly of us, we think, we're on this high and I love this and this is awesome and I must be doing a really good job. And then the pendulum can swing if somebody is critical or unhappy with me or I've failed because I'm a sinner and I do, then if my identity is not rooted in Christ, then I can lead to the self-deprecation or the guilt and shame. So my value, my worth, my confidence has to be found in Christ's work on the cross and his righteousness. Also accepting the fact that I will always disappoint somebody. There will probably always be disappointment in some ways because I can't be everywhere or do everything, even if those are things that I want to do. So that I have to keep my eyes fixed on the cross and be confident in what God is leading, even making those decisions like Carly talked about of when is it best to focus on my children and leading my home, when is it best to step out and do other things. I think even with the expectation thing, something that comes to mind is even the danger of comparison. How much I've found that is dangerous and can lead to really bad things, even for my emotional health, if I am comparing myself with other women, with other pastors' wives, comparing our ministry with other ministries, our church with other churches, or having this preconceived idea about what ministry success is and what that should look like. So I think that all kind of goes along with those expectations. So just being careful of that I'm not comparing, that my eyes are fixed ahead to what God has called us to, what he's called me to. And yeah, finding my identity and my value in him and not in what I do or what other people think about me.
Yeah, I was actually told not long ago in having this conversation about expectations on pastors' wives, I was told by a pastor, a ministry leader, that his belief was that the expectation that should be on us is that we love Jesus and love people. And that was it. And, how that plays out being very different for each of us because we are gifted uniquely and God has done that and done a great work in each of us. So, I'm thinking, Megan, I don't play the piano. And I know you lead worship and sing beautifully.
I do play the piano. So his response was, "You're such a good pastor's wife."
Well, I would not be. I do not have a musical bone in my body. I should not be leading the choir. That would not be a good role for me. And yet I believe that God has uniquely purposed me to serve him. Now, sometimes that's within the church. Sometimes, Carly, to your point, that's right here in my home. And that's my children. And I will say I had to learn a hard lesson on that a couple of years ago, right after my daughter was born. I was asked to join a committee and yeah, I'm in, this sounds awesome and whatever, and learned very fast that, we just added another child to our family. And, and I was also just in the midst of going back to work and working full time and supporting my husband and then trying to be a part of this as well. I could not do that well. And Carly, you said this earlier, a lot of times those expectations come from ourselves. And I think that was true for me then. Somebody had asked me, but there wasn't an expectation I do it. It was something that I wanted to show off that I could do this thing. And I had to very humbly then excuse myself and say, this is not the season for me to be involved here. And I think hopefully that then opens that opportunity for somebody else who's gifted well to use their gifts and abilities. But that my role, again, going back to that, to love Jesus and to seek him and his guidance, and then to love people. And that just takes so many different formats. That may be in the church, in our neighborhood, in our families, in the places that God opens up, and seeking him in that. And I think I'm still very much in a season of learning that from him, of learning to ask him instead of looking for my own opportunities, or looking for the opportunities that other people are trying to put on me. But to say, God, where do you want me to serve? And how can I advance your kingdom? How can I serve your kingdom? And how can I do that well? Where do you want to use me? And so it's definitely an evolution and a journey. And in that, of course, one of the main people that we serve in this role is our husband. And I want to be clear, I don't mean that in a servanthood negative way, but in a marriage, a very healthy and thriving marriage, which is what we all hope for, I think, of wanting to encourage our husbands, wanting to assist them, wanting to support them. They're doing a really unique and special thing for God's kingdom and serving as a pastor or ministry leader. And so our role oftentimes is more behind the scenes of how we support and encourage them. But even that has its own challenges, because sometimes we're privy to things that others in the church would not be. And so wanting to kind of step into that side of things that I think sometimes people don't always realize, of the weight that we're often carrying, knowing what our husbands are navigating. That can be confidential information, that can be heavy decisions within the church or ministry, that can be other hurts that he knows about, there can be hurts done to him. And so how do you all carry that weight, and how do you walk through that?
I feel like my image of church was quickly shattered when we stepped into a vocational role of working for a church. I grew up in a really small Christian independent Bible church in the country. My best friend was the pastor's daughter. And so I had this like idealistic view of church. I thought, I would love to have my whole life be this, and it's perfect. And I love our church and the leadership. And I'm sure there are a lot of things that she carried and her family carried that I wasn't aware of until I stepped in behind the scenes and saw that. And it's only because, you know, we work with humans, and humans are sinful, and things happen. But I quickly realized that, wow, there's a lot of stuff that goes on behind the scenes with, you know, other people on staff or just people in the congregation. And when David would come home and dump all that on me, you know, day after day, I realized early on in our marriage, I said, I can't carry all of this because I have no one to talk to about it. I mean, you can tell me about it, but then I'm stuck. I can't share it with anybody else. And I didn't want to see people in a different light. I didn't want to run into someone at church and know something that, you know, she had said something horrible to my husband, you know, that week. And then now I need to serve alongside of her. And I didn't want to carry that with me. And so, he actually reached out to another really good friend who also was a pastor at a different church, and they started a formed accountability, and they were able to be, you know, trusted brothers in Christ and share what was on their hearts with each other. And that was much healthier. And then he's much more guarded now in what he chooses to share with me, only because, you know, my mother bear instinct will come out, and, you know, you'll be protective of your husband and things that go on. And I didn't want to carry all of that. And so that was a huge blessing when he found someone that he trusted, that he could share these things with. And it was really good for our marriage to be able to.
Yeah. I have joked with people that, you know, people talk about mama bear, and that's kind of a thing in our society, is that wife bear is a real thing. And so, yeah, I know that feeling. Megan, how about you? How do you carry that weight? And what have you and Adam done to try to navigate that?
Yeah, I think it's required even more wisdom for him in knowing and figuring out what to share, what not to share. I will be clear, like anybody's, personal things that come to Adam for counseling or those kind of things, like he doesn't share any of that with me, unless they want it to be shared with me. But as far as like the goings on or things that Carly was talking about, yeah, it's been hard. It's hard to we're still trying to figure out those balances along the way, because we found if he doesn't share any of it with me, but I can still tell from his demeanor that he's carrying this load, and then that affects our marriage. Or I want to be able to love him well and encourage him well and serve him well. So I think it is tricky finding wisdom and knowing what do I need to know, what do I not need to know, and we're trying to figure that out. And I like what you said, Carly, too, about Dave finding someone that he could share those things with. Even Adam's been in a process of even going to a Christian counselor, and that has really helped because he can talk about stuff there. He's given a biblical perspective on it, so that helps with some of his he can kind of process it and handle it well. And then if it's something that we need to talk about together, so that has been helpful for us. I think it's helpful for me to understand the weight and the responsibility if he does share things with me, or I do know things that are going on within the church. It's something to take really seriously, and I have to do it with a lot of integrity, knowing the weight of that. And I think just reminding myself of that I need to be helpful with him in that. So like my words need to be beneficial and helpful, not leading him to sin, not leading him to resentment. Because I think with that mama bear instinct, our first instinct can be to just protect and get around. And that was terrible. Like that's awful. So pointing him back to the gospel, having that unique, wonderful, really like opportunity and responsibility to love him well, to point him to truth rather than adding to the problem. So just, but he's become very good at protecting me from things that would hinder my ministry, and that aren't helpful to know.
Yeah. Yeah, and I so appreciate both of you, because I identify with both of you and the things you've said. I think there is kind of that wife bear, like I said, instincts to want, especially when there's hurt or frustration, which does happen. It's because churches are made up of people, and we're all sinful people. So I don't want this to come across as like my poor husband, but just, hey, we're in this together, and it gets messy sometimes, and we step on each other's toes, and whether hurts are intentional or not, they happen, and particularly in really difficult seasons. And so, Carly, you said something that I was like, oh, been there, of where almost too much is being shared, and feeling very lonely of where do I go with this? And I remember saying to Eric at one point that like, you get to go back to work and continue to work on this, like, which feels productive to me. Like, even if it's hard, you're at least addressing it and trying to do something with it. And I just sit with it. And it's really challenging. And Megan, thank you for sharing even that Adam's been bold enough and brave enough to enter into counseling and seek that assistance. I will say I have, in my journey, seen 2 counselors since Eric and I have been married, and both of them were pastors' wives. But their vocation and really their own ministry was doing professional Christian counseling. And that was very beneficial for me to go to and talk to someone and have a place to just unload that, because so many of my closest friends were either congregants or other people on the church staff, and even those who have to report to my husband. And so discussing those things with them would not be appropriate. It would not be beneficial to anybody. And so trying to go through that journey of figuring out, where is an appropriate and beneficial place for me to emotionally process what I know and what I'm carrying, and how do we do that in a biblical way that doesn't lead to that resentment you were talking about, Megan, or that heaven forbid, would ever become gossip. That's not what we want. And so, yeah, finding those outlets, and even amongst other pastors' wives who can have that conversation. And I know that there are churches, there are some who do it and some who don't. And I think it just really depends where you're at. I'm not saying either one is right or wrong, but churches where the pastors' wives come together themselves. And if you're in a group like that, I just encourage you and applaud you for it, because I think that we can really support each other as ministry wives in praying for each other and supporting each other, even when we don't know the details, but just knowing that we're going through a hard season, of having those folks that we can kind of tap on and say, would carry me to the feet of Jesus and pray for me. I'm just navigating something hard, or I'm carrying something heavy. So yeah, just knowing what that is. And with that, I think we kind of touched on it, but I want to be sure to really even address it more directly. I think we've talked about it in a physical sense of activity, but also an emotional sense of the things we carry. Are there boundaries that you and your spouse have put into place that kind of help navigate some of these challenges? And again, there's lots of ways we can frame that. So I'm going to leave it pretty open there and just say, what boundaries do you put in place, both for your marriage, and I'm also going to extend this a little bit, but for our kids as well?
I kind of touched on the boundaries with marriage. Dave's really careful in what he shares with me. And I do appreciate that he has some trusted fellow friends who are pastors that he's able to bounce things off of and download some of that onto. For our kids specifically, we are super careful to not talk about anything around them. We have older kids now, and I've just seen other families in the church who their kids know more than they need to know, and you see that come out. And I don't want ever that to be a scenario with our children where, kids don't have a filter usually for those kinds of things. And so we're super careful to not share that with our children. In terms of boundaries with church things, I don't ever want my kids to grow up and be resentful to being a pastor's kid for the church. I want them to just find joy in the church and the local church. And Dave and I are just such huge supporters and believers in, God's ordained local church. And so we always try to feel them out in terms of their involvement. And I don't want to be dragging my kids to things that they don't want to be at. I'm careful now that we have 2 middle schoolers to not have them be involved in things that are not appropriate yet for their level of middle school, because usually I always bring them with me, but they're not high school yet. So we're going to stay back and not do that high school all-nighter, because you're not in high school yet and you need to look forward to that when you're in high school. I don't want you burnt out from youth group until you're ready to be in that stage. So having to sit back a little bit. And so far we've been so blessed. Our kids love, they would do more than we would let them do if we were just to allow them. And so I want that always to be the case, and for them to find their own areas to serve too, and not necessarily think they have to be part of the youth group. So we have a couple kids who one does the tech crew, one serves in children's ministry. And it's just been so fun to see them find their own place to serve in our church, and not be there on their own, by choice, and not because, they're the pastor's kid. And funny quick little story. When our one son was little, I feel like he was getting so comfortable with church. He walked in the church one Sunday morning and he kicked off his shoes by the front door and walked himself to class. And I said, well, I guess you feel at home here, because that's what we do at our house. You take off your shoes at the front door but I love it. I love that, watching them, pastors' kids, and find joy in it. I hope that's always the case. I know in a lot of families that is not always the case. So we feel really blessed that our kids currently take joy in the role that they have.
Yeah, that's awesome. I know when we were in Frederick, we had he just turned 4, but he was 3 when we were in Frederick, and he was kind of the same way. It's like he was off and running, and we just had so many members of our congregation who loved our kids so well. And just, you could tell they just walked in and that was home for them in so many ways. And I will say that is one of the beautiful parts of being a ministry family, is when your church loves on your baby as well. And we were blessed by that too. Megan, what are your thoughts on healthy boundaries for both your marriage as well as your kids and your family as a whole?
Yeah. I think as far as marriage goes, this was easier to do before we had kids, but I remember those first few years when we didn't have children. One of our things we tried to put into place is that we didn't talk about church stuff all the time at home. which meant that we like would have to go for a walk, or we would go out and do something and talk about what we needed to talk about. But I remember thinking like, okay, I know that by the time we walk back in the door, like we were going to be done. That's harder now with kids because there's only so many times that you can have conversations. But like Carly said, we're not going to talk about hard things in front of them. I do think it's important when there are things that we can share. I think it's good for them to see that like the church isn't perfect. We love the church. We love the people of the church. But to even have a healthy perspective of like this, you know, sometimes there's hard things that we have to work through or walk through. But just giving ourselves space of like, there has to be a time where we're not talking about it all the time, that it overwhelms. And I think it is something that for us was really difficult through pandemic stuff and being at home and him working from home and us, you know, kind of being thrust into, we have to figure out how to do ministry all over again, really for this season. And so it could get like suffocating and overwhelming because any spare minute we had to be talking about stuff. So that's, the lines got kind of hard there. I think just the reminder and what we've been better at over the past year is just really setting up a Sabbath for ourselves, like Sabbath rest. Because obviously Sundays are not restful. They're wonderful and we love them and our whole family looks forward to them, but they're pretty much a like morning to evening thing that's very full of people. So we love it and we receive energy from it, but it can also be draining and it's not a rest. So for us, we will even like look at the calendar and write on the calendar like this is our Sabbath, because it doesn't have to be a Sunday. So figuring out when are we going to set aside time this week that we are going to do things that are going to inspire our worship. So not just like lazy, like we'll just watch Netflix all day. Maybe sometimes that's appropriate and helpful. But I'm talking more rest that is like feeding my own soul, feeding my own mind, inspiring my worship and awe of God personally and as a family, and where we can just take a break. And it's always a good reminder that like ultimately even this ministry is not up to us. Like God can do what he wants to do and what he purposes to do without our help. So it's good to take a break, to set up boundaries of, you know, times where we're not going to have our phones or check our phones, just little things like that. Because I think even with our children, they're watching that too. Like how often daddy's on his phone, you know, so doing those things, but also, yeah, for our kids, like instilling a love for the church. And I'm very thankful too that it's been a really positive experience thus far with our kids. Through the pandemic, that was the thing that my kids struggled with the most, is not seeing their church family, which really shows me how well they are loved and what a high regard they have for their dad's position. But consistently reminding them too that we love you more than we love our ministry. We love you more than we love our church, and we love our church. But even kind of having like a mission statement as a family, consistently going back to it and making our decisions out of like, this is our purpose statement, this is our mission statement, which we really want to be rooted in the gospel, reminding ourselves of who we are, of what we're called to do. Going to scripture to make those decisions. And even adding like back to the previous conversation of when there is criticism or when there are hard things that happen, I think just learning also that we really want to handle criticism well and have soft hearts. I've heard it said that pastors' wives, it requires tough skin but a soft heart, like being able to take the criticism. And I also don't want to like immediately dismiss it or defend myself, because there are times where that criticism is merited and there's truth in it and there's things that we need to learn from it. So to kind of be able to sit in it, to search our hearts in it, but also to know that when there are times that, you know, things are not merited or are unfair or are mean or cruel, just even going back to the gospel, and that like, this is not mine to avenge. This is not, God can handle even protecting. My character is not even mine to protect or to prove. So leaving that in the Lord's hands too, and understanding that even the weight of my words to my husband they carry so much more weight than anybody else's. So figuring out, like, how am I going to be wise in how I use my words to him? How am I going to point him back to Christ, and use that responsibility well, and to my kids as well, like reminding them that, like, there's not a different expectation put on you because you're the pastor's kids. Like, we want that to be a great calling that they feel to be in ministry, but never that the negative thing of, well, you need to perform, you need to act. Like, to have the freedom and the grace in that, of for them too, that they can learn and grow without feeling that pressure of that they need to be something specific.
Yeah. Yeah, I finished reading not long ago. It took me an embarrassingly long time to read it, but Sacred Privilege by Kay Warren, which is specifically written to pastors' wives. And towards the end of it, there was a piece that she talked about of being in ministry, the need for radical forgiveness. And we're called to that anyway, frankly, whether we're in ministry or not, because Christ has radically forgiven us, and certainly radically forgiven me for things that I would be embarrassed to admit. But his grace, his forgiveness is radical. And so in ministry, when we face these challenges of needing to practice radical forgiveness, and even I so appreciated she was in her writing was saying that it both to give and to receive radical forgiveness. I don't always walk this path well. And sometimes, Megan, like you said, when criticism comes, sometimes I have to take that in and listen to what's the truth of that, and where is there a place that I need to improve. Or if it's given to my husband and my wife bear is coming out, it's like, well, is there truth for us to receive? And do we need to even ask for forgiveness in that? But also when those things come, that whether intentional or not, because sometimes they're just simply not intentional, but just things that hurt and sting, we need to practice that radical forgiveness of Christ, and to remember that that's because he showed it to us first. And pointing ourselves back to the gift of the gospel to stay rooted in that. And I think that that's where our freedom lies. Even as we try to, and sometimes I will also say, sometimes that's radical forgiveness in our marriages too, of needing to figure out those boundaries and how do we navigate all of this together, because in our marriage, it is it's a ministry walk we're doing together, whether we are serving full-time alongside our husbands or not. We are full-time wives. And so we certainly want to encourage them and support them in that. So with that, and kind of as we're entering in the end of our time together, I want to be sure that we end on some positive notes here, because there is such just great joy and great privilege in ministry. And while I've seen the hard seasons, I've also seen really beautiful things come out too, and I'm sure you both have. So I'm going to pose two questions at one time and let you guys kind of answer however you like. But for one, just what has been a great support or encouragement to you? And this may or may not be the same thing, but what has been one of your greatest joys about serving in ministry?
I think one of the joys is just seeing how God uses imperfect people to accomplish his work, and how, when we feel so inadequate, we still see, the fruit of, even if it may come years later. I love seeing, especially in student ministry, you get to see such radical change so quickly, because you see these students as middle schoolers. And then now our first middle school class that we had, most of them now are married. A lot of them are serving. We have a couple of pastors. We have some church planters. We have a missionary. And it's just so cool to see, like, God working through their life. And that's just like immediate, gratification and joy to see how God worked in their lives. So that's more of an immediate thing. I know a lot of things you don't get to see. We'll never see in our lifetime, how God, the seeds that you plant now, how God chooses to grow those. And also one is just watching even my husband just evolve and mature in his role. And when he gets a chance to preach, hearing, maybe it's a little, I don't know, self-centered, but like, just it brings me joy to hear when people, when God works through him and they're moved and learn from his teaching. And it just brings me a lot of joy to see him use his giftings and all the work that he's put in over the years to just grow in his faith and to love God and love others and use his talents and see them bless others has been just a huge joy.
Nice.
I forget what your other question was. You did too. What was your other one?
What's been your biggest support and encouragement as a ministry wife, as well as your greatest joy? And again, those maybe are the same thing, but maybe not. So
yeah, I think encouragement, I think Megan touched on it several times, is just the times where I feel discouraged. I know it's the times I'm not in the Word when I need to be. So I think being rooted in the Word is where you're going to find your encouragement, and not relying on others or your husband to provide that longing and that fulfillment that you need, because they'll never accomplish it. So just learning to find your identity in Christ, your joy in Christ, and that first, also just having other women that I can connect with who are in a similar situation, who are ministry wives, has been huge for me. And my heart goes out to those who are in smaller churches, or their husband and me is the only pastor on staff, or they're a young youth pastor's wife, and they only have, the older senior pastor and his wife on staff, and they don't connect. So I encourage you to find another woman who's in ministry, maybe at a different church or a different circle, and reach out, because that's been a huge encouragement and support for me, just to have someone who understands, because it's a very joyful role. It's a very unique role. And it's not something you can share openly with your friends who are in your congregation.
Right. Megan, how about you? Your biggest support or encouragement, as well as your greatest joy?
Yeah, I think the thing that is kind of always the most encouraging is just when people allow us to just be us, and they pursue relationship with us, not because he's the pastor and we're the ministry family, but they just want to know us as Adam and Megan. Having people that pursue my heart just for the sake of pursuing my heart, not because of the role that I carry. So just wanting to know me, wanting to spend time with us, giving us the freedom of when we need to rest, when we have people in our lives that even force us to get away when we need to get away, and make that possible for us. So if that's financially, they pave the way so that we can actually do it. You've talked about it before, but just I think the boost of like seeing our kids loved well and our family loved well in that way. So even feeling the support of people stepping in and saying, like, we really want to spend some time with your kids, invest in your kids, or give you a break even, can be super helpful. I think it's most encouraging too to just see people rise up and be equipped to do ministry with us. So to have teammates alongside that. I'm very much a words person. So a simple like card or note or text reminding me that I'm loved and I'm being prayed for is helpful. Recently, I've had to be reminded that just the way that I want to receive love, or the way that I tend to give it to others, isn't always the way that people are naturally going to do it to me. So I think in this role of being a pastor's wife, it can be very isolating. And if I'm only looking for one specific type of encouragement, I'm going to feel more isolated and discouraged, rather than opening my eyes to what are the ways that other people are trying to love me well, trying to offer help and support and encouragement and communicate love to me, that are in these other ways that maybe I'm not looking for. So that has been helpful for me. Just the joys of some of the same things that Carly talked about. I think just getting to see God do it, getting to see him grow a church, and ultimately know that it really wasn't about us in the first place. Getting him to do things that like we couldn't explain or couldn't have done. Seeing marriages restored, seeing people grow. Just, I get, one of my greatest joys is being in my family room with a group of women studying the Word together, and seeing that hunger develop and that joy develop in studying the Word together has been some of my greatest joys. And with that, also with my husband, like getting to see, like Carly said, him grow, and getting to, I've had to learn over the years to be okay with being unseen and stepping back and letting him be the one perhaps promoted, or wanting that, and knowing that I remember I was in college and I was on a missions trip, and we were serving alongside some missionaries, and The missionary wife, I just remember thinking like she was beautiful. She was like super capable. She had a great singing voice. She was very like confident and talented. And I remember asking her like, so what is your role in this? Like what, and I'm expecting like, oh, I lead this and I do this and I am in charge of this. And she said nothing. She literally looked at her husband across the room and pointed to him. And she said, he's my primary ministry. That was the first thing that came to her mind. And that really stuck with me, because God gives me giftings and abilities and ways to use those things for his glory and all these other ways. But I get this really unique privilege of loving my husband well, of making home a safe place, of encouraging him, of speaking truth and love when I need to, of getting to walk this together. I don't remember the context exactly of this story, but I heard a story once of a city, a village that was under attack, and the enemy was coming in and like knocking on the walls, and they said that they would allow the women to leave, and the women were allowed to take one possession with them or one thing that they treasured with them. And as they waited for the women to leave, because they were going to destroy the whole city and everybody else in it, all the women were coming out of the city with their husbands on their backs. Mm-hmm. And I remember just like weeping in that, of just like this responsibility and this privilege and this joy of getting to be the one to walk with him, getting to be the one to at times carry him when he's weak or when things are really hard, and vice versa. All the while understanding that the Lord is the one that's carrying both of us. So I just think the further along we go in this, the more we're going to be able to look back and see like God was really kind, even to make us walk through that hard stuff. And how awesome is it that we got to be a part of something that was so much bigger than us or what we ever thought.
Yeah. Yeah. And I mean, both of you have touched on this throughout our conversation, but I think that's, if I would leave our listeners with anything, is remembering that we are part of God's bigger story. And what an honor and a privilege that he would use us. And I think even when I sit and reflect on his larger story, I feel so inadequate, so small, and yet he has chosen me to be part of it. And he's chosen each of you, and he's chosen each of our listeners to be part of his story. And so each of our paths looks different, but it's all woven together in this tapestry. And so, it just, again, to anybody who's listening, whether you're in one of those really challenging times or whether you're in one of those really joyful times, or frankly, maybe it's both, because I think so often we think about like highs and valleys and mountaintops and valleys, and sometimes it's not. Sometimes it's not either or, it's both. There are things that are hard and there are things that are really awesome. And so whatever it is that you're walking through right now, you're part of God's bigger tapestry, and we're all kind of navigating that together and hopefully looking to the Father to guide us through each step of it. And just what an honor it is that he allows us to do that and invites us into that. So I just want to thank both of you for taking your time today with us, for being willing to share your stories and be vulnerable with us about those things that are challenging as well as those things that are joyful. I think you both are awesome. I've gotten the privilege to certainly meet you both and spend time with you both outside of this. And I just am encouraged by the ways that you're supporting your husbands, the ways that you're serving your church ministries, and as well as your own ministries, and just walking this route. So thank you for that.